Close your eyes if you haven't already done so. Let your shoulders soften and settle into whatever surface holds you now, and let your breath come slowly, deeply, without effort. There is nothing you need to do in this moment. There is nowhere you are required to be. The day has ended, or the night has settled in, or perhaps the hours between midnight and morning have arrived with their familiar quiet weight, and here you are, still awake, still listening, which is perfectly fine. Let the sound of this voice be something gentle, something unhurried, the way a river is unhurried as it finds its path through old stone. And let us drift together, back through time, back through centuries, through the long and quiet corridors of human history, to a world of olive trees and marble columns, of sandal-worn paths and the low murmur of the agora in the early hours of a Mediterranean morning. We are going to talk tonight about a plant, a quiet, unassuming plant with hollow stems and small white flowers that grows along the edges of roads and streams and places where the land has been disturbed. A plant that has been called many things across many centuries, but which carries at its center one of the most famous stories in all of human civilization. We are going to talk about hemlock. And if this voice is already helping you rest, consider subscribing to this channel, though only if you are still awake to do so, and only if you feel so inclined. There is no urgency in it. Let your breathing slow now. Let your arms grow heavy. Let each word be a soft weight pressing you gently downward, into rest, into the slow drift of history and botany and philosophy that we will trace together across this long, unhurried evening. It was in the year 399 before the Common Era, in the city of Athens, in the fading warmth of a spring afternoon, that a man of approximately 70 years of age was handed a cup and asked to drink from it. The man was named Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, a stonemason by birth, and a philosopher by choice. A man who had spent the better part of 4 decades wandering the public spaces of one of the ancient world's most celebrated cities, asking questions that no one else thought to ask, and questioning answers that everyone else had accepted without examination. He was not a tall man, by most accounts, nor a particularly handsome one. The ancient sources, including those of his student Plato, describe him as broad and somewhat rough in appearance, with a flat nose and eyes that many found disconcerting in their directness. Yet there was something about him, something that drew people to listen, and something that, in the end, drew the attention of those who found his questions deeply inconvenient. The trial of Socrates is one of the most studied legal proceedings in all of antiquity, and yet it remains, in many ways, deeply difficult to interpret with certainty. What we know of it comes to us, filtered through the writing of his students and admirers, who had reasons both personal and philosophical to shape the account in particular directions. What we can say is this. On a day in the year 399 before the Common Era, Socrates stood before a jury of approximately 501 Athenian male citizens, selected by lot in a law court near the center of Athens, to answer charges that had been brought against him by 3 men whose names the historical record has preserved. The first was Meletus, described in the historical sources as a poet, a younger man who appears to have been, in the estimation of most historians, something of an instrument in the hands of the second and more powerful accuser, Anytus, a middle-class politician from a family of tanners, who had played a significant role in the restoration of Athenian democracy, and who appears to have been genuinely troubled by what Socrates represented. The third accuser was a man named Lycon, a rhetorician, and the charges that Meletus formally swore out against Socrates were these, preserved in the records of the Athenian State Office known as the metroon, that Socrates was guilty of refusing to acknowledge the gods recognized by the state, of introducing new and different divinities, and of corrupting the youth of Athens. The penalty demanded was death. The trial proceeded across the course of a single day, as was the Athenian custom for most legal proceedings. Miletus and Anytus and Lycon each mounted a small stage in the law court and delivered their speeches to the assembled jury, making the case for Socrates' guilt. Socrates then spoke in his own defense, in an address that Plato later recorded in the dialogue known as the Apology, a word which in its original Greek meaning carries the sense not of remorse but of formal self-justification. And in that address, by all accounts, Socrates did something remarkable, and, from the perspective of a defendant seeking acquittal, something deeply counterproductive. Rather than lowering his voice and softening his manner, and expressing the kind of humble deference to the assembled jury that Athenian legal custom expected, Socrates continued to question, continued to argue, continued to do, in essence, the very thing he had always done. He suggested, at one point in the proceedings, that the appropriate penalty for a man of his service to the city might be free meals for life at the Prytaneum, a civic honor typically reserved for Olympic victors. The jury, which had initially voted for his guilt by a margin of perhaps 280 to 220, voted for the death penalty by a considerably wider margin. What followed was not immediate. Athenian laws had a particular provision that in times of religious festival, the execution of a condemned prisoner was to be suspended until the sacred ship returned from its voyage to the island of Delos, a journey undertaken in honor of the god Apollo. And so Socrates waited for a period of approximately 30 days, confined within an Athenian prison. And during those 30 days, his friends and students came to visit him. And those conversations, as recorded and perhaps considerably embellished by Plato, form the basis of several of the most enduring philosophical dialogues in the Western tradition. There was Crito, who came to urge Socrates to escape, and who had apparently arranged the means to do so, and Socrates declined, as was his way, through argument, through the careful examination of what it would mean for a man who had spent his life advocating for the rule of law to break that law at the moment it became personally inconvenient. And there was the longer, more elaborate dialogue that Plato titled the Phaedo, named for a young man who was present on the final day, and who reported the events of that morning and afternoon to Plato's circle some time afterward. It was in the Phaedo that the death of Socrates was described, and it was from the Phaedo that much of what the subsequent centuries believed about hemlock poisoning derived, for better or for worse, because Plato, as modern toxicologists have noted with some care, appears to have modified the account of his teacher's death in ways that served philosophical rather than medical purposes. The death Plato described was a calm and almost graceful one, a progressive numbness, beginning in the feet and legs, and rising slowly through the body until it reached the heart, with Socrates remaining mentally clear and conversationally engaged until very nearly the end. It was a death suited to a philosopher, a death that demonstrated the tranquility of a mind at peace with its own dissolution, and, while this account is broadly consistent with the effects of the active compound in hemlock, a substance called conium, there are details in Plato's account that modern pharmacologists have found inconsistent with what is now known about the plant's toxicology. Plato does not mention, for example, the abdominal discomfort or muscular twitching that modern reports of hemlock poisoning typically describe, and it seems likely, as researchers have suggested, that these details were simply omitted so as not to compromise the philosophical nobility of the scene. The plant itself, Conium maculatum, is a member of the family Apiaceae, a broad and botanically significant family that includes such familiar herbs as parsley and fennel and coriander, which makes it, in a certain sense, deeply and historically inconvenient, because poison hemlock closely resembles many of its harmless relatives, enough so that the resemblance has contributed to accidental poisonings across many different cultures and many different centuries. It grows to a height of between 1 and 3 meters in favorable conditions, with hollow stems that bear the distinctive reddish or purplish mottling that, in later European folk tradition, came to be associated with the blood of those it had killed, and with large, feathery leaves that emit a distinctly unpleasant odor when crushed, an odor that has been described by various historical sources as mousy or rank, and which constitutes one of the few reliable distinguishing characteristics that separates it from the many lookalikes that share its habitat. The plant produces small white flowers arranged in umbrella-like clusters called umbels, and these flowers bloom in the late spring and early summer, and they are, in their way, quietly beautiful, the kind of beauty that the old herbalists noted with a mixture of admiration and unease. It is native to Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa, and in its native range, it favors disturbed ground, roadsides, the margins of streams and ditches, and the edges of fields, thriving in the transitional spaces between cultivation and wilderness that human settlement inevitably creates. It was already ancient by the time the Greeks were using it, already embedded in the landscape of the Mediterranean world, already recognized and named, and catalogued among the plants that required careful handling. The name the Greeks gave it was Conium, from which the Latin conium derives, and it was in the Greek world, in the city-states of the Aegean and the Ionian coast, that hemlock first acquired its most historically consequential association. As the official instrument of state execution, the drink administered to those whom the democratic courts of Athens had condemned to die. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this long historical evening, to consider what a remarkable thing that is. That a democracy, one of the earliest and most philosophically celebrated democratic societies in human history, chose as its official method of capital punishment a plant preparation that required the condemned to be his own executioner, to take the cup with his own hands and drink from it of his own will. There is a philosophical dimension to this that the ancient Athenians do not appear to have discussed at length in any surviving texts, but which seems worth noticing in the slow, unhurried space of a night like this, as the sound of this voice carries you gently further and further from wakefulness. The hemlock cup was not imposed from without, in the manner of most executions across most of human history. It was handed over, and the condemned was expected to drink. And in the particular case of Socrates, there is a quality to that act, a deliberateness, a philosophical consistency that has resonated through every subsequent century in which his story has been read and retold and wondered at. Meanwhile, in the broader world of ancient Greek medicine and botanical knowledge, hemlock occupied a position of considerable complexity, for it was not only an instrument of death, but also, in carefully controlled and considerably smaller quantities, a medicine. And this double nature, this capacity to heal and to kill, depending entirely on the quantity administered, was something that the Greeks understood quite well, and which Hippocrates himself, the great physician of the island of Kos, whose work forms the foundational layer of Western medical thought, appears to have been aware of. The Hippocratic tradition, which flourished roughly a century before the death of Socrates and continued to develop through the period of his life and beyond, acknowledged hemlock's properties as an antispasmodic, a substance that could reduce involuntary muscular contractions, and there are references in various ancient texts to its use as a topical treatment for conditions involving swelling and skin irritation, applied externally in small quantities to the affected area, without the lethal internal dose passing into the body as a whole. The Greeks of the classical period had developed, through centuries of empirical observation, a sophisticated understanding of the distinction between medicinal and toxic doses of many plant substances, and hemlock was among the most carefully calibrated of these. A plant that demanded respect precisely because the margin between its therapeutic and its lethal effects was so narrow. Theophrastus, the great Athenian naturalist, who studied under Aristotle and who compiled the first systematic botanical catalogue in the Western tradition, his Historia Plantarum, wrote about hemlock with the careful observational precision that characterized his entire life's work. He noted its habitat preferences, its distinctive features, its toxicity, and the various ways in which the potency of hemlock preparations could vary, depending on the conditions under which the plant had grown, a matter of considerable practical importance to those whose professional responsibilities included preparing them. It was understood, for example, that hemlock grown in shaded, damp conditions tended to produce more potent preparations than hemlock grown in full sun, and that the seeds and roots of the plant were generally more dangerous than the leaves, and that the plant's toxicity varied across the seasons, being most concentrated during and just after the period of flowering. These were the kinds of observations that accumulated over generations of careful, and no doubt sometimes fatal, empirical inquiry, and they found their way into the tradition of Greek botanical knowledge that Theophrastus helped to codify and preserve. The mechanism by which hemlock achieves its effects on the human body was not, of course, understood in these precise terms by the ancient Greeks, who had no knowledge of alkaloids or nicotinic acetylcholine receptors or the neuromuscular junction, but what they could observe, and what they described with reasonable accuracy, was the progression of the poisoning from its earliest stages through to its conclusion. The active compound responsible for the plant's toxicity is conine, a piperidine alkaloid, and conine works by binding to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors at the point where nerve and muscle meet, blocking the signal that would ordinarily cause muscles to contract. This blocking effect produces a progressive muscular paralysis that, in the account preserved by Plato, and consistent with modern toxicological understanding, begins in the lower extremities and moves upward through the body. The feet grow numb, and then the calves, and then the thighs, and the paralysis continues to ascend. And eventually it reaches the muscles of the chest and diaphragm that are responsible for breathing, and it is at that point, when respiratory function ceases, that death occurs through the accumulation of insufficient oxygen reaching the blood. The mind, protected behind the barrier of the skull in ways that the body's peripheral muscles are not, may remain functional for some portion of this process. And it was this quality, this preservation of mental clarity, even as the body ceases to respond, that Plato chose to emphasize in his account of his teacher's final hours. Only 3 milligrams of conine, a quantity almost invisibly small, is sufficient to produce the first symptoms of toxicity in a human being, and the lethal dose, while variable depending on the individual's body weight and health, and the concentration of the preparation, is not dramatically larger. The ancient Athenians, or more precisely the officials whose responsibility it was to prepare the hemlock drink administered to the condemned, would have been aware that the preparation required care, that the quantity and concentration mattered, that an insufficient dose might cause suffering without death, and that the exact circumstances of the plant's cultivation and harvest could influence the outcome. There is something quietly sobering in the calm and distant way that history sometimes produces in contemplating the fact that somewhere in Athens, in the year 399 before the Common Era, there was a person, an official or a servant of the state, whose job on a given spring afternoon was to grind hemlock seeds or press hemlock leaves and prepare a drink of the appropriate concentration, and to carry it to the prison and to hand it to the man inside. That man, sitting in a prison cell in Athens on the last afternoon of his life, surrounded by his friends and students, and speaking with them about the immortality of the soul, about whether a person who has spent his life in the pursuit of wisdom has reason to fear death, was not, by all accounts, afraid. The Phaedo describes him as calm, as engaged, as something approaching serene, though we must remember always, when reading Plato, that we are reading Plato. A grieving student who adored his teacher, and who had strong reasons, philosophical and personal, to present that final day in the most philosophically meaningful light possible. When the jailer came to him and told him it was time, Socrates called for the cup, and when his friends around him began to weep, he reportedly expressed something like mild, affectionate reproach, asking them to restrain themselves, and noting that he had sent the women away earlier precisely to avoid this kind of lamentation. He took the cup, he drank it, he walked around the cell as he had been instructed to help the poison distribute through his body, and then he lay down, and the numbness began in his feet, and it rose, slowly and steadily, as the afternoon light in Athens fell quietly toward evening. The Phaedo records his last words as a request directed to his friend Crito, asking that a debt be paid, a rooster owed to the god Asclepius, the god of healing and medicine. Scholars have spent considerable effort across many centuries interpreting this final request, which has the quality of a puzzle or a riddle, as so many things about Socrates tend to do. Perhaps it was a literal debt, a promise made and not yet kept. Perhaps it was a philosophical statement, a suggestion that death itself was a kind of healing, a release from the sickness of embodied existence. Perhaps it was something simpler and more human, a man in his final moments, thinking of a small obligation left incomplete, wanting to leave the world without loose ends. We cannot know with certainty, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps the story alive, part of what ensures that 2,400 years later, someone is still writing about it, and someone is still listening. It was the year 399, and it was Athens, and it was Hemlock, and the story was only beginning. In the decades and centuries that followed the death of Socrates, the Hemlock cup became something considerably larger than the instrument of a single execution. It became a symbol, or rather a cluster of symbols, layered and sometimes contradictory, that different thinkers and different traditions reached for when they needed to talk about the relationship between the individual and the state, between philosophical integrity and political power, between the pursuit of truth and the consequences of making that pursuit too visible and too inconvenient for those in authority. Plato, who was not present at the execution, who was said to be ill on that day, dedicated much of the rest of his long and extraordinarily productive life to constructing a philosophical system that was, in part, a response to what had happened in that prison cell in 399, and to the question that the Hemlock Cup posed with such quiet and terrible clarity. What does it mean to live a just life in an unjust city? And what does it mean to accept an unjust death at the hands of a city whose laws you have nonetheless chosen to obey? Plato's dialogues, written across roughly 50 years of intellectual labor, return again and again to the figure of Socrates, to the memory of his conversation and his method and his death. And through those dialogues, the image of Socrates drinking the hemlock was distributed across the entire literate world of antiquity, carried in scrolls through Alexandria and Pergamon and Rome, copied and recopied in monasteries, through the long centuries of the European Middle Ages, translated and debated and painted and sculpted in the Renaissance. And it continues, even now, to serve as one of the foundational images of Western moral philosophy. It is perhaps the most famous poisoning in all of history, and yet it is worth remembering, in the quiet and unhurried way, that this kind of reflection deserves. That at the moment it occurred, it was simply the execution of an old man who had made himself unpopular, carried out by a procedure that had been used on many others before him, and that would continue to be used on others after him, administered by means of a plant that grew by the side of every road in Attica, and that any farmer or traveller would have recognized instantly. The historical record suggests that hemlock execution was a fairly common practice in Athens during the classical period, and not only in Athens, but in other Greek city-states as well, and that Socrates was not the first person to die by this means, nor the last. What made his death different was not the method, but the meaning that accumulated around it afterward, the layers of philosophical interpretation and artistic representation and political allegory that his students and their students and the centuries beyond them continued to add, like sediment accumulating in still water, until the cup itself, the physical cup of hemlock preparation carried to a cell in Athens on a spring afternoon in the 4th century before the Common Era, became something almost impossible to see clearly beneath all that accumulated significance. Aristotle, who arrived in Athens to study at Plato's Academy in approximately 367 before the Common Era, some 32 years after the death of Socrates, would have grown up in a philosophical world already shaped by the interpretation of that event, already organized in part around the question of what the Hemlock Cup meant. Aristotle was in many ways Plato's greatest student, and also his most decisive critic, and his approach to the natural world, including to plants and their properties, was considerably more empirical and systematic than his teachers, more interested in careful observation and classification than in philosophical allegory. When Aristotle eventually founded his own school, the Lyceum, and began to produce the vast encyclopedic works of natural history and philosophy that would define so much of subsequent Western intellectual life, he brought to the study of the living world a methodology that owed something to the careful watching and questioning that Socrates had modeled, even if the subject matter was very different. And in that Aristotelian tradition, in the long centuries of commentary and elaboration and translation that followed his work, the plant world, including the toxic plant world, including hemlock itself, continued to be observed and described and incorporated into the growing body of medical and botanical knowledge that the ancient world was slowly and carefully building. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who served in the armies of the Roman Emperor Nero in the 1st century of the Common Era, and who compiled the De Materia Medica, a systematic catalogue of medicinal plants and substances that would remain the authoritative reference work in European pharmacology for more than 15 centuries, included hemlock among his entries with the clinical precision and the careful ambivalence that the plant's dual nature required. He described its appearance, its habitat, the ways in which it could be identified and prepared, and the uses to which it could be put in medicine, as well as the dangers of excessive dosage and the treatment of poisoning. His entry on hemlock was neither sensational nor dismissive, but simply careful and thorough, in the manner of a man who understood that knowledge of a plant's toxicity was as important as knowledge of its therapeutic properties, perhaps more important, and that both kinds of knowledge belong together in the same text, available to the practitioner who needed them. Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist, who compiled his Natural Historia around 77 of the Common Era, and who died in the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79, also included observations on hemlock, noting its distribution across the Italian peninsula and its uses in Roman medicine. The Roman world had inherited from the Greek world not only the knowledge of hemlock, but also, to a considerable degree, the complex of meanings attached to it, the philosophical resonance of the Socratic death, though the Romans brought to these inheritances their characteristic combination of practical utility and rather more casual attitude toward the act of poisoning itself. For Rome was a world in which poisoning as a political tool had achieved a sophistication and a frequency that the Athenians, with their hemlock cup and their jury trials, had not quite reached. It is worth noting, as we trace the slow drift of hemlock through the ancient world and into the centuries that followed, that the plant's medical uses were genuine and recognized and employed across a remarkable range of conditions, even as its lethal properties were also known and sometimes deliberately employed. In the Hippocratic tradition, and in the traditions that developed from it through Galen, the great physician of the 2nd century of the Common Era, whose work synthesized centuries of Greek and Roman medical thought, hemlock in carefully controlled topical or small internal preparations was used for conditions including tumors and ulcers, and what the ancient sources describe as skin eruptions, and it was used as an antispasmodic to reduce the involuntary muscular contractions associated with various conditions. The Greeks of the classical period had also used it in very small quantities for arthritic conditions, attempting to leverage its paralytic properties in a controlled way to reduce pain and inflammation in joints that were swollen and painful. All of this reflects a sophistication about dose and effect that is easy to underestimate when looking back across 2.5 millennia. And it reflects as well the particular kind of empirical intelligence that the ancient medical tradition embodied, a tradition of careful watching and recording and adjusting, built up over generations by practitioners who had learned from experience, and from the experience of their predecessors, what the plant could do and what it could not be trusted to do. The Roman period saw hemlock distributed more widely across the Mediterranean world and into northern Europe as Roman settlement expanded the boundaries of the world that had been shaped by Greek and subsequently Roman culture. The plant itself, Conium maculatum, was already native to much of this expanded territory, already growing in the ditches and roadsides of Gaul and Britannia and the Germanic territories, already recognized by the peoples of those regions in their own botanical traditions, though not always associated with the specific philosophical and political meanings it had acquired in Athens. In the Roman provinces of northern Europe, hemlock was simply part of the landscape, a plant to be avoided by those who did not know what they were doing, and understood by those who did, a component of the local herbalist's knowledge, taken on its own terms, rather than through the lens of a particular philosophical death in a particular distant city. During this period, spanning the long centuries of Roman imperial expansion and the gradual integration of diverse regional botanical traditions into a broader Mediterranean and then European synthesis, hemlock's medicinal reputation persisted alongside its reputation for danger, the two aspects existing in a kind of permanent tension that practitioners navigated through experience and inherited knowledge. It was this tension between the plant's capacity to relieve and its capacity to kill that made it such a persistent presence in the medical literature of antiquity, and the early medieval period always appearing in the catalogues and the herbals and the pharmacological compilations, always described with that particular quality of careful attention that dangerous things tend to attract, always occupying a position at the edge of what was therapeutically useful and what was simply lethal. The margin between those two conditions being, as it had always been, a matter of precise and difficult calibration. As the Western Roman Empire declined through the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era and the political and cultural structures of the classical world began their long, gradual dissolution, the botanical and medical knowledge that had been compiled and systematized over centuries did not disappear, but it did fragment, dispersing into the monastic libraries of the emerging Christian world, into the courts and academies of the surviving Eastern Empire in Constantinople, into the libraries of the Persian and Arab scholars who were, during these centuries, doing the careful work of preserving and translating and extending the classical tradition. And hemlock travelled with this knowledge, carried in manuscripts through the long transition from the ancient world to the medieval, carried in the practical knowledge of herbalists and healers who continued to use it and to recognize it, carried in the philosophical and literary tradition as the instrument of Socrates' death, an association so powerful and so deeply embedded that it would survive the collapse of classical civilization and emerge, recognizable and still resonant, into the world that came after. The monastery gardens of early medieval Europe, where monks cultivated plants for both food and medicine, in the systematic tradition that Benedict of Nursia had established in the 6th century, generally maintained some knowledge of the more dangerous medicinal plants, hemlock among them, as part of the broader heritage of practical botanical knowledge that the Church had absorbed from classical sources. These gardens were, in a sense, the principal surviving institutional framework for botanical knowledge in Western Europe during the early medieval centuries, the places where the information contained in texts like Dioscorides' De Materia Medica, increasingly available in Latin translation and increasingly integrated into the medical practice of the Church's healing institutions, could be tested against actual growing plants and actual medicinal preparations. The monks who tended these gardens and who prepared medicines from their contents were not philosophers contemplating the hemlock cup of Socrates. They were practitioners engaged in the daily work of healing the sick and the injured, and their relationship to the plants they worked with was shaped by that practical orientation, by the immediate needs of the bodies they were trying to help, rather than by the accumulated philosophical significance of any particular plant's history. It was also during this period, in the long and varied centuries of the European Middle Ages, that hemlock began to acquire associations that were rather different from both its pharmaceutical role and its philosophical meaning, associations with the darker and more transgressive uses of plant knowledge that European folk culture gathered under the general category of witchcraft and sorcery, the plant's undeniable power to affect the human body its capacity to produce states that were genuinely strange and disorienting in sublethal doses, and its dangerous reputation made it a natural candidate for inclusion in the lore of those who were believed to have knowledge beyond the ordinary, the village herbalists and wise women, and cunning men and healers who occupied that ambiguous boundary between respected practical skill and suspected dangerous knowledge that the medieval church regarded with increasing unease as the centuries advanced. Hemlock appeared in various medieval texts alongside other powerfully active plants, including belladonna and henbane and mandrake, in the category of plants associated with magical practice, with flying ointments, with the ability to induce states of consciousness that were attributed to supernatural rather than pharmacological causes by those who experienced or observed them. The flying ointments of European folk magic, which appear in the records of inquisitorial proceedings and in the writings of various medieval and early modern authors who were attempting to explain or debunk, or sometimes simply describe, the phenomena associated with witchcraft, typically contained some combination of powerfully active plant substances, and hemlock was among those cited in various accounts. Whether these preparations produced genuine altered states, and whether those states might account for the experiences that individuals described or confessed to, depending on the circumstances in which their testimony was obtained, is a question that has been examined with considerable care by historians of early modern witchcraft and by pharmacologists interested in the psychoactive properties of the alkaloids involved. The answer that emerges from the most careful of these investigations is a complicated one, suggesting that some of the substances involved were indeed capable of producing vivid and disorienting experiences, and that the overlap between these induced states and the cultural expectations and frameworks within which they were interpreted was a significant factor in shaping the accounts that survive in the historical record. The 13th century German abbess and theologian Hildegard of Bingen, whose extensive writings on natural history and medicine constitute one of the most remarkable individual contributions to the medieval understanding of the plant world, included hemlock in her pharmacological Compendium Physica, describing it with the careful and somewhat idiosyncratic mixture of practical observation and symbolic interpretation that characterizes her work. Throughout, Hildegard was not a physician in the institutional sense, but she was an extraordinarily careful observer of the natural world, and her descriptions of the plants she included in the Physica reflect genuine botanical and pharmacological knowledge, accumulated over a lifetime of observation and practice. Her entry on hemlock acknowledges its toxicity and its limited therapeutic uses, and it reflects the broader medieval understanding of the plant as something that demanded respect and caution, something that operated at the boundary of the permissible, something whose power could be turned toward healing only with the greatest care and the most precise judgment. Over the course of the later medieval centuries, as European universities began to develop systematic programs of medical education, and as the classical texts that formed the foundation of that education became more reliably available and more thoroughly integrated into formal medical training, the knowledge of hemlock and other toxic plants that had been preserved in monastic and folk traditions began to be reformulated within a more structured academic framework. The medical schools of Salerno and later Bologna and Montpellier drew on the textual tradition of Dioscorides and Galen and the Arabic commentators and compilers who had elaborated upon that tradition And within that textual tradition, hemlock occupied its established place as a plant of recognized medicinal value in controlled application and recognized lethal danger in larger doses. The physicians who emerged from these schools brought to their practice a more systematic and text-based approach to plant medicines, though they also, inevitably, drew on the empirical knowledge of the practitioners who had come before them, the accumulated experience of generations, who had worked directly with the plants themselves, without the benefit of formal medical education, but with the advantage of direct and sustained observation. It is worth considering, from the comfortable and well-lit distance of the 21st century, what it must have meant to practice medicine in a world where the most powerful tools available were plants, where the difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was measured by eye and experience rather than by any standardized unit of measurement, and where the consequences of error fell directly and immediately on the person being treated. The practitioners who worked with hemlock in the medieval period, whether in monastic settings or in the folk tradition or in the emerging academic medical institutions, were operating in conditions that required a kind of judgment that is difficult to fully appreciate from the outside, a judgment built from accumulated experience and transmitted through instruction and observation, fragile in the way that all practical knowledge is fragile when it depends on direct transmission from person to person, vulnerable to being lost in the disruptions of plague and war and the persecution of those who held it. The Black Death, that catastrophic outbreak of plague that swept through Europe, beginning in the late 1340s, disrupted essentially every aspect of European civilization, including the transmission of medical and botanical knowledge. The loss of so many practitioners, so many of the people who held the accumulated practical knowledge of their communities and their traditions in such a short period of time, created gaps in the knowledge traditions of the continent that took generations to repair, and in some cases were never fully repaired, because the particular individuals who had held particular pieces of knowledge were gone, and what they had known went with them. In this broader context of disruption and loss, the knowledge of hemlock, like the knowledge of many other medicinal plants, was scattered and fragmented, and sometimes lost, and sometimes preserved in incomplete or distorted forms carried forward by those who survived into a world that was, in many ways, starting over. And yet the plant itself continued to grow, quietly and without concern for the catastrophes occurring in the human world around it, in the ditches and roadsides and disturbed ground of Europe, as it had always grown, producing its hollow purple mottled stems and its small white umbel flowers each spring, as indifferent to the significance that human cultures had attached to it, as it was indifferent to the loss of the human knowledge about it. Conium maculatum waited, as plants wait, in the patient way of living things that have no investment in whether they are understood or feared or used or ignored, simply present in the landscape, available to whoever came along, with the knowledge or the curiosity or the desperation to make use of it. And in the centuries that followed the Black Death, as Europe slowly reconstituted its knowledge traditions and its institutions, hemlock remained where it had always been, growing at the edge of the road, waiting to be encountered again. The Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of inquiry and artistic and intellectual ambition that began in the Italian city, states of the 14th and 15th centuries, and spread gradually across the whole of Europe, brought with it a renewed engagement with the classical texts of antiquity, including the medical and botanical texts, and through that renewed engagement, a renewed interest in the plants those texts described. the humanist scholars who drove the Renaissance project were deeply invested in recovering the authentic classical tradition, in going back to the original Greek texts and reading them carefully and critically, rather than simply accepting the medieval commentaries and translations that had accumulated around them. And this philological ambition extended to the botanical and medical literature, as well as to philosophy and literature and rhetoric. New translations of Dioscorides' De Materia Medica were produced, more accurate and more carefully annotated than the medieval versions. And with them came renewed attention to the plants described, including hemlock, including the careful description of its properties and its dangers and its uses. The botanical garden, that distinctly Renaissance institution that combined aesthetic pleasure with scientific inquiry and educational purpose, emerged during this period as one of the primary settings in which plants from the classical tradition could be cultivated and observed and studied in a systematic way. The first formal botanical gardens in Europe were established in Italy in the mid-16th century, at Pisa in 1544 and at Padua in 1545, both affiliated with universities and both intended as living laboratories for the study of medicinal plants. Hemlock had a place in these gardens, its dangerous reputation making it, if anything, more interesting rather than less, a plant that embodied the principle that the same natural substance could be both a medicine and a poison, a principle that was central to the emerging science of pharmacology, and that the Renaissance botanists were particularly invested in understanding and articulating. It was in the context of these early botanical gardens and in the broader culture of naturalistic inquiry that they embodied that the study of hemlock began its slow transition from folk knowledge and classical textual commentary towards something that would eventually become modern scientific investigation, though that transition would take several more centuries to complete, and the path it followed would be neither straight nor uninterrupted. And so, as the 16th century gathered itself into the 17th, and as the intellectual movements that we now call the scientific revolution began to reshape the ways in which European thinkers understood the natural world, hemlock continued its quiet presence in the European landscape, in the botanical gardens and the medical texts, and the folk traditions, and the philosophical memory of Athens carried forward into a new era of inquiry that was beginning, slowly and fitfully, to ask different kinds of questions about how things worked and to develop different kinds of tools for answering those questions. The story of hemlock was far from over, and the plant itself showed no signs of going anywhere. It continued to grow in its patient, unhurried way in the ditches and the margins and the disturbed ground of the old world, waiting for the new world to come and encounter it, which, in the fullness of time, it would. Sources consulted for historical accuracy: Plato's Phaedo and Apology, Theophrastus's Historia Plantarum, the toxicological record of Conium maculatum, historical records of the trial of Socrates, medieval botanical traditions, and Renaissance botanical history. The 17th century arrived in Europe carrying with it a particular quality of intellectual restlessness, a sense that the inherited frameworks of understanding, the systems of knowledge passed down from Aristotle and Galen and the medieval commentators who had elaborated upon their work, were beginning to strain at the edges, beginning to reveal their limits in ways that the more careful and more empirically minded observers of the natural world were finding increasingly difficult to overlook or explain away. It was a century that would produce, among its many extraordinary intellectual achievements, the foundations of what we now call the scientific method, the systematic approach to investigating the natural world through observation and experiment and the careful recording of results. And this new approach would eventually transform the understanding of plants like hemlock from a matter of accumulated folk wisdom and classical textual authority into a matter of chemistry and physiology and controlled experimental inquiry. But that transformation was slow, and it was uneven, and it proceeded alongside rather than in simple replacement of the older ways of knowing, so that throughout the 17th century and well into the 18th, the understanding of hemlock remained a complex layering of ancient knowledge and newer observation, of classical authority and emerging scientific inquiry, of medical practice and folk tradition and philosophical memory, all coexisting in the same world, sometimes in productive tension and sometimes in simple parallel, like streams running beside each other without yet joining. The figure of Socrates, drinking the hemlock cup, remained present in the cultural imagination of educated Europe throughout this period, carried by the Platonic dialogues that were read and discussed in the universities and academies and private libraries of the continent, available as a reference point and a touchstone for anyone thinking about questions of conscience or political authority or the relationship between individual judgment and collective law. Rembrandt van Rijn, the great Dutch master of light and shadow, who was born in Leiden in 1606, and who would spend his life exploring the emotional and moral dimensions of the human figure, did not himself paint the death of Socrates, but the theme was a recurring one in European painting of the period, and the image of the old philosopher, accepting the cup with equanimity, remained a compelling subject for artists attempting to render philosophical virtue in visible form. The French painter Jacques-Louis David would return to this subject with extraordinary power at the end of the 18th century, in a painting that carried its own particular political freight. But throughout the 17th century, the image circulated in prints and smaller paintings, and in the literary references of the humanist tradition, keeping the hemlock cup present in the visual and verbal imagination of an educated European public that was simultaneously developing new tools for understanding what the plant in that cup actually did to the human body and why. It was a period of productive contradiction, of old meaning and new method existing side by side. And it was precisely this contradiction, this coexistence of the philosophical and the pharmacological, that made hemlock such an interesting case for those who were beginning to think about the relationship between the symbolic weight of natural substances and the physical realities that those substances embodied. The natural philosophers of the 17th century, men like Francis Bacon in England and René Descartes in France, were working to establish the primacy of direct investigation over inherited authority, arguing that the natural world should be understood through engagement with it, rather than through the reading of texts about it. And this methodological shift, gradual and contested as it was, would eventually produce a very different understanding of what hemlock was and how it worked than the one that Dioscorides and Galen had provided, though it would take some time before the specific chemistry of Conium and its effects on the neuromuscular system could be described in anything like the terms that modern toxicology uses. During this period, the practical knowledge of hemlock in medical use persisted in a modified form, employed by physicians who were increasingly aware of the difficulty of controlling its dosage and increasingly cautious about its internal use, even as topical applications continued to be employed for various external conditions. The English physician Nicholas Culpeper, whose Complete Herbal of 1653 became one of the most widely read botanical and medical texts in the English language, included Hemlock in his catalogue, describing it with characteristic directness and a mixture of practical caution and folk wisdom that reflects the particular tradition of English herbal medicine in which he worked, a tradition that drew on both the classical textual inheritance and the accumulated practical knowledge of English herbalists and healers across many generations. Culpeper's entry on Hemlock acknowledges both its dangers and its uses, recommending topical applications for conditions including tumors and swellings, while warning explicitly against internal administration. And his discussion reflects the broad consensus of 17th century medical practice on the matter, which was essentially that hemlock was too dangerous to use internally with any reliability and too useful externally to abandon entirely. And so the plant continued its double life, present in the medical cabinet, and present in the landscape, and present in the philosophical imagination, carrying its accumulated weight of meaning and its very real pharmacological properties through the years and decades of the 17th century, as the world around it slowly, almost imperceptibly, changed. The 18th century brought with it the Enlightenment, that extended project of intellectual clarification and rationalization that swept through the courts and academies and coffee houses of Europe with a confidence in human reason and a commitment to systematic inquiry that had consequences for essentially every field of knowledge, including the knowledge of plants and their properties. It was the century of Linnaeus, the great Swedish naturalist, Carl von Linné, who spent his extraordinarily productive life developing the binomial classification system that gave every living thing a standardized Latin name consisting of genus and species, and who assigned to poison hemlock the name Conium maculatum, the name that it still carries in botanical science today, the name that places it precisely within the order of living things and distinguishes it formally and systematically from every other plant in the world. Linnaeus published the foundational text of his classification system, the Systema Naturae, in 1735, and he continued to develop and refine it across subsequent decades, and the effect of his work on the botanical sciences was transformative, providing a common language and a common framework within which botanists from different countries and different traditions could communicate with each other about the same plants without the confusion that had arisen from the multiplicity of local and vernacular names that different traditions had accumulated. For hemlock, which had been known by different names in different languages across many centuries, Greek Conium and Latin cicuta and English hemlock, and a variety of vernacular names in French and German and Italian and other languages, the Linnaean designation Conium maculatum provided a stable point of reference, a name that carried with it both the plant's genus, Conium, derived from the ancient Greek term, and its species epithet, maculatum, the Latin word for spotted, referring to the distinctive purplish mottling of the stem that had always been one of the plant's most recognizable identifying features. The Linnaean project was not merely one of naming, however. It was part of a broader Enlightenment ambition to understand the natural world systematically, to move from the accumulated and sometimes contradictory observations of many different traditions toward a unified and coherent account of how the living world was organized. And this ambition had implications for the study of plant chemistry and pharmacology, as well as for the physicians and chemists of the 18th century were increasingly interested in the question of what exactly it was in plants, like hemlock, that produced their physiological effects. What specific substance or combination of substances was responsible for the toxicity, and how that substance acted on the human body. And this interest would eventually lead, in the early decades of the 19th century, to the isolation and characterization of Conium. But in the 18th century itself, the tools of chemical analysis were not yet refined enough to answer these questions with precision, and the understanding of hemlock remained essentially descriptive rather than mechanistic, a matter of recording what the plant did to the body, without being able to explain, in precise chemical terms, how it did it. The Enlightenment century did, however, produce one remarkable episode in the medical history of hemlock that is worth pausing over in some detail, because it illustrates with particular clarity the complexity of the plant's therapeutic status and the difficulty of working with a substance whose dose-response relationship was so narrow and so variable. In the 1760s, a Viennese physician named Anton von Sturck, who had trained in the tradition of the Vienna Medical School and who was working under the patronage of the Habsburg court, undertook a systematic program of investigation into the therapeutic potential of several highly toxic plants, including hemlock, beginning on himself and then extending to patients under his care. Sturck's work on hemlock, published in the early 1760s in a series of Latin treatises, reported apparently successful therapeutic outcomes in a range of conditions, including cancer and other tumors and skin diseases, and it attracted considerable attention in the European medical community, generating both enthusiastic adoption and skeptical criticism in roughly equal measure, as new therapeutic claims in medicine tend to do. His methods would not satisfy modern standards of clinical evidence, and the reliability of his reported outcomes has been questioned by subsequent historians of medicine, but his willingness to experiment systematically with a substance that most of his contemporaries regarded as simply too dangerous for internal use reflects the broader Enlightenment spirit of inquiry, the willingness to test inherited assumptions against direct observation. And so through the long, candlelit years of the 18th century, hemlock continued to occupy its complicated position at the intersection of danger and utility, carrying the weight of its classical associations and its folk reputation and its uncertain therapeutic promise, waiting for the chemistry that would eventually explain it. The isolation of conine, the principal toxic alkaloid of Conium maculatum, represents one of the landmark achievements of early 19th century organic chemistry, and it belongs to a specific moment in the history of science, when the tools of chemical analysis had advanced just far enough to allow researchers to extract and characterize the active principles of toxic plants with sufficient precision to begin understanding their pharmacological action. The story of this isolation begins in the early decades of the 19th century, in the laboratories of German chemists who were working in the tradition of what was then the most advanced chemical science in the world, applying the emerging methods of organic chemistry to the analysis of plant substances. The German chemist L. Gieseske is credited with producing an early preparation of the active alkaloid from hemlock in 1827, and subsequent work by other researchers refined this isolation. But it was the work of the chemist A.W. von Hofmann and others in the mid-19th century that established the molecular structure of conine with sufficient precision to allow a genuine chemical understanding of the substance. Coniine is a relatively simple molecule by the standards of organic chemistry, a piperidine alkaloid with the molecular formula C8H1N, and it was in fact one of the first alkaloids to be synthesized in the laboratory, a milestone achieved in 1886 by the German chemist Albert Ladenburg, who accomplished this synthesis by a route that confirmed the molecular structure that had been proposed by earlier analytical work. The significance of Ladenburg's synthesis was considerable, both for the specific understanding of Conium and for the broader development of organic chemistry, because it demonstrated for the first time that a naturally occurring alkaloid with known physiological activity could be reproduced entirely from non-biological materials in the laboratory, a finding that had implications extending well beyond the specific case of Hemlock. Meanwhile, the physiological investigation of Conium's effects on the body was proceeding in parallel, and by the mid-19th century, researchers had established with reasonable clarity that Conium produced its effects by interfering with the transmission of nerve signals to muscles, producing the ascending paralysis that Plato had described in the Phaedo, though the precise molecular mechanism by which this interference occurred, the binding of Conium to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction, would not be fully understood until the 20th century, when the science of molecular pharmacology had developed the conceptual and technical tools necessary to investigate these interactions at the level of individual receptor molecules. The 19th century was also the period during which hemlock's status as a legitimate medical treatment was in serious decline, as the increasing recognition of the difficulties involved in controlling its dosage and the increasing availability of other therapeutic agents with more predictable dose-response relationships made it less and less attractive as a clinical tool. The Edinburgh physician John Hughes Bennett, writing in the 1840s and 1850s, attempted a systematic evaluation of hemlock's therapeutic claims, and while his work was more methodologically rigorous than Sturck's 18th century investigations, the results were inconclusive enough to strengthen the skeptical case rather than the enthusiastic one. By the latter decades of the 19th century, hemlock had largely disappeared from the standard pharmacopoeia of Western medicine, replaced by other substances and by the growing range of synthetic compounds that the expanding pharmaceutical industry was beginning to produce, and its medical significance was becoming primarily a matter of historical interest rather than clinical relevance. It retained its toxicological significance, of course, as cases of accidental poisoning continued to occur with some regularity, particularly in regions where the plant was abundant and where it was mistaken for harmless relatives like wild parsley or water hemlock or wild carrot, and the documentation of these cases contributed to the growing clinical literature on the symptoms and progression of hemlock poisoning and the appropriate medical responses to it. And in the domain of philosophy and cultural history, the plant retained the extraordinary resonance that it had carried since the day in 399 before the Common Era, when a cup of its prepared juice had been handed to an old man in an Athenian prison, a resonance that no amount of chemical analysis or clinical evaluation could diminish, because that resonance lived not in the chemistry of Conium, but in the human story wrapped around it. The 19th century was also the period during which hemlock crossed the Atlantic in significant quantities, establishing itself as an invasive weed in North America, with the kind of quiet, persistent efficiency that characterizes the most successful plant colonizers. The plant had arrived in North America gradually, carried in ship ballast and soil, and perhaps intentionally, as part of the herbal traditions of European settlers, who brought with them the practical, botanical knowledge of their homelands, and by the 19th century, it was establishing itself in the disturbed ground and roadsides and agricultural margins of the eastern United States and Canada, spreading westward as settlement and agriculture extended the kind of landscape it preferred. The arrival of hemlock in North America added a new chapter to its long history because the North American context was different from the European one, in ways that had consequences for how the plant was encountered and understood and responded to. There was no indigenous North American tradition of knowledge about Conium maculatum specifically, though there were well-developed indigenous botanical traditions that included knowledge of other toxic plants, and the arrival of hemlock in the landscape created a situation in which the existing indigenous knowledge could not simply be applied to the new arrival without new learning and new caution. For European settlers who brought their knowledge of the plant with them, the North American context presented its own challenges. Because the plants spread into new environments, sometimes occurred in conditions that increased the likelihood of confusion with other plants, and the regularity with which accidental poisonings of both humans and livestock were reported through the 19th and early 20th centuries reflects the difficulty of maintaining reliable knowledge about a dangerous plant across a frontier landscape where formal institutions for transmitting such knowledge were often sparse or absent. The poisoning of livestock by hemlock became a significant agricultural concern in many parts of North America as the plant spread because cattle and horses and sheep that grazed in areas where hemlock was growing were vulnerable to the same paralytic effects that the plant produced in humans, and the economic consequences of livestock losses to hemlock poisoning were sufficient to generate considerable practical attention to the problem of identifying, managing, and where possible, eliminating the plant from grazing land. The United States Department of Agriculture and State Agricultural Extension Services accumulated documentation of hemlock poisoning cases through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this documentation contributed to a growing body of practical knowledge about the plant's distribution, its toxicity to different species, and the conditions under which poisoning was most likely to occur. Meanwhile, the spread of hemlock through North America continued, the plant finding in the disturbed and transitional landscapes of a rapidly changing continent exactly the conditions it had always favored, moving along roadsides and riverbanks and the margins of fields and construction sites, establishing itself in the spaces between human uses of the land with the patient efficiency of a plant that had been doing exactly this for millions of years. The expansion of railway networks through the 19th century, which created long linear corridors of disturbed ground running across the continent, provided particularly favorable pathways for the spread of invasive plants, including hemlock, and by the end of the 19th century, the plant was present in much of the eastern and central United States, and was continuing to extend its range westward. The documentation of this spread and the growing understanding of the plant's biology and toxicology that accumulated alongside it represented a new form of engagement with hemlock, one shaped not by the philosophical traditions of Athens or the medical traditions of Galen, but by the practical concerns of an agricultural society encountering a dangerous plant in its fields and along its roads. And this new form of engagement added another layer to the already extraordinarily complex history of a plant that had, over the course of more than 2.5 millennia, accumulated more layers of human meaning than almost any other species in the botanical world. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the convergence of several developments in the scientific understanding of hemlock and its toxic alkaloid that would eventually transform that understanding from the descriptive and empirical to the mechanistic and molecular. The science of pharmacology, which emerged as a formal discipline in the latter half of the 19th century, with the establishment of the first pharmacological research institutes in Germany and elsewhere, brought to the study of toxic plant substances a new level of experimental rigor and a new set of conceptual tools for thinking about how drugs and poisons acted on the body. The concept of the receptor, the idea that drugs and other bioactive substances produced their effects by binding to specific molecular targets in cells and tissues, was developed primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the work of researchers including the German pharmacologist Paul Ehrlich and the British physiologist John Newport Langley. And this conceptual advance was directly relevant to the understanding of Conium, which would eventually be recognized as a molecule that produced its effects by binding to a specific class of receptor at the neuromuscular junction. Langley's work in the 1900s and 1910s on the pharmacology of nicotine and curare and other substances that acted at the junction between nerve and muscle laid important groundwork for understanding the mechanism of conine's action. Because conine, like nicotine, interacts with what would come to be called the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, the molecular gateway through which the nerve signal that commands muscular contraction is normally transmitted. The recognition that conine and nicotine acted at the same receptor site, producing related but somewhat different effects, depending on their specific molecular geometry and their binding characteristics, was an important insight that helped to place the toxicology of hemlock within a broader pharmacological framework, and to connect it to the growing understanding of neuromuscular transmission that was accumulating through the early decades of the 20th century. This period also saw continuing investigation of the other alkaloids present in Conium maculatum, beyond conine itself, because the plant contains several related piperidine alkaloids, including gamma-conosine, N-methylconine, and conhydrine, and the relative contributions of these different compounds to the plant's overall toxicity became a subject of careful research. Gamma-conosine, in particular, was found to be present in significant concentrations in the green vegetative parts of the plant, and to be somewhat more potent than conine itself, and this finding helped to explain why some accounts of hemlock poisoning had described symptoms that seemed more severe or more rapidly developing than would be expected from conine alone. The teratogenic properties of the hemlock alkaloids, their capacity to cause developmental abnormalities in the offspring of animals that consumed the plant during pregnancy, were also documented during this period through the investigation of livestock poisoning cases, and this finding added another dimension to the plant's already complex toxicological profile. The work of these decades, undertaken in the pharmacological laboratories of Europe and North America, built up a detailed and increasingly precise picture of what hemlock was and what it did, a picture that confirmed in its broad outlines the accounts that Plato and Dioscorides and Galen and Theophrastus had provided, while adding to those accounts a level of mechanistic explanation that would have been entirely incomprehensible to any of them. But that would have, one suspects, been deeply interesting to all of them. The ancient Greek natural philosophers, after all, were precisely the people who wanted to understand not only what things did, but why they did it. And the 20th century answer to the question of why hemlock paralyzed the body. The answer, in terms of receptor binding and neuromuscular blockade and respiratory failure, was exactly the kind of mechanistic explanation that the tradition of natural philosophical inquiry had always been seeking. The 20th century brought hemlock's history into an era of modern toxicology, forensic medicine, and environmental concern, adding new chapters to a story that had already stretched across more than 2 millennia of human engagement with a single remarkable plant. The development of modern analytical chemistry, and in particular, the techniques of chromatography and mass spectrometry that became available from the mid-20th century onward, made it possible to detect and quantify Conium and the other hemlock alkaloids in biological samples with extraordinary sensitivity and precision, transforming the forensic investigation of suspected hemlock poisoning from a largely descriptive exercise into a rigorous chemical analysis. These analytical advances had both practical and historical consequences. Practical, in the sense of enabling more reliable identification of hemlock poisoning in medical and forensic contexts, and historical in the sense of enabling retrospective analysis of historical poisoning cases, including, most notably, the case of Socrates himself. The question of whether Socrates was in fact poisoned by Conium maculatum or by some other plant or combination of plants has been examined in the light of modern toxicological knowledge with considerable care by various researchers, and the conclusions of these analyses have been broadly consistent with the traditional attribution, while also identifying the aspects of Plato's account that are inconsistent with what is known about Conium's pharmacology. The 2009 paper, published in the journal Clinical Toxicology by C. Gill and colleagues, and subsequent analyses in the years that followed, examined the symptoms described in the Phaedo against the known toxicological profile of Conium maculatum, and concluded that the account was broadly consistent with hemlock poisoning, with the noted discrepancy that Plato's description of a calm and painless death with preserved consciousness until very late in the process is somewhat idealized relative to what modern case reports suggest the actual experience of Conium poisoning tends to be. The environmental history of hemlock in the 20th century is in many ways a story of spread and increasing concern as the plant continued to extend its range in North America and in other parts of the world where it had been introduced, and as the awareness of its dangers grew alongside the growth of environmental and public health monitoring. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw increasing documentation of hemlock's spread in states including Ohio and Indiana, and California, where populations of the plant were noted to be expanding in ways that public health authorities and agricultural managers found concerning, and various programs of monitoring and management were developed in response. The challenge of managing hemlock in the contemporary landscape is complicated by the same features that have always characterized the plant's relationship with humans, the close resemblance to harmless relatives, the variability of toxicity depending on growing conditions and plant parts, and the combination of genuine dangerousness with a certain understated, almost pastoral appearance that makes it easy to overlook or underestimate. The plant's presence in the modern world is, in one sense, the same as it has always been. It grows where it has always grown, in the disturbed margins of the human landscape, in the transitional spaces that human activity creates, and then partially abandons, and it carries in its hollow stems and its small white flowers the same chemistry it has always carried, the Conium that moves through the body with the patient, ascending progression that Plato described more than 2,000 years ago with the specific purposes of a philosopher rather than a toxicologist, but with a descriptive accuracy that the intervening millennia of scientific investigation have largely confirmed. And it is here, in the quiet persistence of the plant itself, that one of the most reflective dimensions of Hemlock's long history can be found. The way in which the natural world continues its own work entirely independent of the meanings that human cultures attach to it, entire and self-sufficient and fundamentally indifferent to the extraordinary weight of philosophical and historical and cultural significance that has accumulated around one particular cup of its prepared juice. Conium maculatum did not know that Socrates was a philosopher. It did not know that the jury that condemned him was engaged in the complex and imperfect project of Athenian democracy. It did not know that Plato would write about the death of his teacher with such art and such a grief, that the account would be read and studied and debated for more than 2,000 years. It simply grew as it had grown before Athens existed, and as it continues to grow today in the ditches and roadsides of 6 continents, producing its alkaloids through the biochemical processes that evolution had assembled in its cells over millions of years for reasons that had nothing to do with philosophy or politics or the history of Western thought, and everything to do with the ecological calculus of survival and reproduction and defense against the animals that might otherwise consume it. This quality of natural indifference, the gap between the enormous human significance that has been attached to hemlock and the plant's own absolute unconcern with that significance, is one of the things that makes its history so quietly instructive, so gently useful as a subject for the kind of reflective attention that a slow evening and a restful state of mind can bring. The plant was here before us, and it will, in all probability, be here after us, growing in its patient and unhurried way in whatever transitional landscapes remain, carrying its chemistry and its capacity for the kind of ending that a hemlock cup represents. While the human world continues its own complicated, meaning-laden, beautifully overwrought engagement with everything that it has come to stand for. The story of Hemlock is, in the end, a story about the relationship between nature and meaning, about the gap between what a thing is and what we make of it, and about the way that gap can be both enormous and, in certain lights, at certain hours of the quiet night, almost invisible. And there is something restful in that recognition, something that allows the mind to settle, like a hand placed gently on still water, into the understanding that the world is very old and very patient and very full of things that have been growing quietly in the margins, long before any of us arrive to notice them, and that will continue to grow there long after we have moved on. Let that thought carry you, gently, further into rest, as the soft evening of history continues to unfold, and as the story of Hemlock settles, like pollen in still air, unhurried and complete. The story of Hemlock in the modern era is, in many ways, a story about forgetting and remembering, about the way that knowledge which was once essential and carefully maintained can recede from the center of human awareness, as the conditions that made it urgent change, and then return in different forms and with different emphases when new circumstances bring it back into focus. By the early decades of the 20th century, hemlock had largely disappeared from the active pharmacopoeia of Western medicine, replaced by the growing arsenal of synthetic compounds that the pharmaceutical industry was producing with increasing speed and sophistication, and the plant that had once occupied a complex and carefully calibrated position in the medical traditions of the ancient and medieval worlds had been reduced in clinical terms to a historical curiosity and a toxicological hazard. Yet the knowledge of the plant persisted in the botanical literature and the toxicological literature and the agricultural extension services and the public health advisories that continued to track its spread and document its dangers, and in the philosophical and cultural tradition that kept the memory of Socrates and the Hemlock cup alive in the educated consciousness of the Western world, available as a reference point and a symbol for anyone who needed it. The 20th century also produced, in the context of the two world wars and the economic catastrophes and social upheavals that marked the period, a renewed interest in the Socratic tradition and the question of what it means to be a person of conscience in a world that makes conscience dangerous. And this renewed interest kept the Hemlock cup present in the cultural imagination in ways that went beyond mere historical memory. The French philosopher Albert Camus, writing in the shadow of the Second World War and the Nazi occupation of France, returned to the question of Socrates and the hemlock, with a particular urgency, seeing in the old philosopher's acceptance of an unjust death a model of intellectual integrity that seemed newly relevant in a world that had demonstrated with devastating clarity what happens when that kind of integrity is absent from public life. The German-American political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who had fled Nazi Germany and who spent much of her intellectual life thinking about the relationship between thought and action and the conditions that make genuine political life possible, also engaged with the Socratic tradition and its implications. And in her engagement, the Hemlock cup appeared not as an antiquarian curiosity, but as a living question about the relationship between philosophy and politics, between the individual conscience and the collective authority that can, under certain circumstances, sentence that conscience to death. These philosophical engagements with the Socratic legacy were not primarily about Hemlock the plant. They were about Hemlock the symbol, about what the cup represented and what it meant that a man had accepted it with equanimity. But they kept the story alive and kept it resonant in ways that pure botanical or toxicological interest alone could not have sustained. And so, the plant and its history moved through the 20th century, carried by these different streams of interest and attention, the scientific and the cultural and the philosophical, flowing alongside each other through the decades, occasionally intersecting and occasionally diverging, but all contributing to the continued presence of hemlock in the human imagination. That quiet, hollow-stemmed plant with the small white flowers and the mousy smell and the ascending paralysis growing by the side of every road. The forensic dimension of hemlock's history, which had been present from the very beginning in the Athenian practice of state execution, acquired new significance in the modern era as the science of forensic toxicology developed the tools to investigate poisoning cases with a precision that earlier centuries could not have imagined. The field of forensic toxicology, which grew out of the intersection of analytical chemistry and legal medicine in the 19th century, and developed rapidly through the 20th, created the institutional and technical framework within which hemlock poisoning could be investigated, documented, and prosecuted as a matter of criminal or civil law. And the growing sensitivity of analytical techniques meant that conium could be detected in biological samples at concentrations far below those that earlier methods could have identified. The development of gas chromatography and mass spectrometry in the mid-20th century was particularly significant for the forensic analysis of hemlock alkaloids, because these techniques allowed the specific identification and quantification of conine and its related compounds in blood, urine, and tissue samples from suspected poisoning victims, providing the kind of unambiguous chemical evidence that legal proceedings require. Cases of hemlock poisoning in the modern era have occurred both accidentally, through the confusion of hemlock with edible plants, and deliberately in the small number of documented cases of intentional poisoning. And the forensic investigation of these cases has contributed to the understanding of how conium behaves in the body over time and how its metabolites can be detected after the initial poisoning event. The accidental poisoning cases are the more numerous and in some ways the more instructive because they reveal the persistent difficulty of distinguishing hemlock from its harmless relatives in field conditions, a difficulty that has claimed lives across every century of the plant's documented history, and that continues to do so in the 21st century in cases documented in the medical literature. Children are particularly vulnerable to accidental hemlock poisoning because they are more likely to handle or taste unfamiliar plants without the caution that adult experience tends to instill, and because their smaller body mass means that a given quantity of conine represents a proportionally larger dose than it would in an adult. The clinical management of hemlock poisoning in the modern era is essentially supportive, focused on maintaining respiratory function through mechanical ventilation, while the body metabolizes and eliminates the alkaloids, because there is no specific antidote for conine toxicity. And the outcome in surviving patients depends largely on how quickly the poisoning is recognized and appropriate supportive care initiated. This absence of a specific antidote is a reminder that, despite the extraordinary advances of modern medicine and pharmacology, there are still aspects of the encounter between hemlock and the human body that medicine manages rather than reverses, still places where the plant's ancient chemistry presents a challenge that the most sophisticated modern tools can only partially address. The forensic and clinical literature on hemlock poisoning, accumulated over the 20th and early 21st centuries, represents, in a certain sense, a new kind of engagement with a very old plant, one shaped by the methods and standards of modern science, but continuous with the long tradition of careful human attention to what hemlock does and how it does it, a tradition that stretches back through Dioscorides and Theophrastus to the first unnamed observer, who noticed that this plant with the hollow stem and the small white flowers could cause a very particular kind of harm. The literary and artistic history of hemlock in the modern era represents perhaps the most diffuse and the most revealing dimension of the plant's continued cultural presence, because it is in literature and art that the accumulated significance of a thing is most freely explored and most creatively transformed, where the constraints of botanical accuracy and clinical precision are relaxed, and the symbolic weight of the subject is allowed to do its work without the mediating framework of scientific method. The hemlock cup of Socrates has appeared, explicitly or by allusion, in an enormous range of modern literature. From the academic and philosophical to the popular and the vernacular, carrying its double charge of historical specificity and universal resonance into contexts that Plato could not possibly have imagined. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great English romantic poet, who read the Platonic dialogues with passion, and who was deeply invested in the Socratic model of intellectual integrity in the face of political oppression, invoked hemlock in his poetry as part of the broader cluster of associations around poisoning and death and the price paid by those who refuse to accommodate themselves to power. John Keats, Shelley's contemporary and fellow romantic, opened his great ode to a nightingale, written in 1819, with the image of having drunk deeply of some dull opiate, describing his drowsy numbness in terms that deliberately echo the clinical progression of hemlock poisoning, connecting the longing for dissolution and escape that the poem explores to the most famous voluntary poisoning in all of literary history. The connection between the Socratic hemlock and the romantic preoccupation with death as a form of release is not accidental. The Romantics were deeply engaged with the Platonic tradition and with the Socratic model of the philosopher who accepts death rather than compromising his intellectual integrity. And this engagement shaped the imagery and the emotional register of their poetry in ways that are still visible to careful readers. The visual arts of the modern period engaged with the Hemlock story through a different set of references, but the image that continued to exercise the most powerful hold on the artistic imagination was the painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Socrates, completed in 1787 on the eve of the French Revolution, and now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. David's painting, which shows Socrates in the act of reaching for the hemlock cup, while his distraught disciples weep around him, was immediately recognized as a political statement, as well as a historical scene, a demonstration through the medium of classical history of the kind of Stoic civic virtue that the reformers and revolutionaries of the period were attempting to embody and to inspire in others. And it has been one of the most reproduced and most discussed images in the Western artistic tradition ever since, carrying the hemlock cup out of the textual tradition and into the visual imagination of millions of people who may never have read a word of Plato. The painting's extraordinary power comes partly from its compositional clarity and its precise historical detail, but partly also from the way it handles the hemlock cup itself, which Socrates reaches for with a gesture of calm deliberateness that somehow manages to be both entirely specific and entirely universal. The gesture of someone accepting what cannot be avoided with a grace that transcends the particular circumstances of the acceptance. And in that grace, in the painted image of a hand reaching for a cup of hemlock, the entire long history of the plant finds one of its most concentrated and most moving expressions. The botanical and the philosophical and the political and the personal gathered into a single gesture that has been contemplating the viewer from a canvas in New York for nearly 2.5 centuries, asking its quiet, unanswerable question. The question of what Socrates' death means has never stopped being asked, and the asking of it has never been simply a matter of historical curiosity. Because the conditions that produced the hemlock cup, the tension between individual conscience and collective authority, between the pursuit of truth and the management of power, between the person who asks inconvenient questions and the institution that finds those questions threatening, are not conditions that belong exclusively to 5th century Athens. They are conditions that recur in different forms and with different specifics across every society and every era that has ever attempted to organize itself around principles of collective decision-making, which is to say, across most of human history. And the hemlock cup serves, in this broader reading, as a kind of permanent reminder of one of the deepest tensions in the human social project, the tension between the freedom of individual thought and the requirements of collective order. The trial of Socrates has been used across many centuries and many different political contexts as an analogy for the treatment of those whose intellectual or political or moral independence brought them into conflict with the power of their time. And the analogy has been applied to figures as different as Galileo and Thomas, More and Nelson Mandela, and many others who found themselves on the wrong side of a legal or political judgment that history subsequently reversed. Whether these analogies are always apt is a question that careful historians tend to approach with caution, because the specific details of Socrates' situation were particular to Athens in 399 and do not map cleanly onto the situations of most later figures who have been compared to him. But the analogical use of the Hemlock cup reflects something genuine about its symbolic power, its capacity to serve as a touchstone for the universal human experience of conscience in conflict with authority. The 20th century provided many occasions for this kind of invocation, from the show trials of Stalinist Russia to the McCarthyite hearings in the United States, to the truth and reconciliation processes in post-apartheid South Africa. And in each of these contexts, the memory of Socrates and the Hemlock offered a framework for thinking about what it means to maintain intellectual and moral integrity under pressure, what it costs, and whether the cost is worth paying. These are not merely academic questions, and they are not merely historical ones. And the persistence with which each new generation has returned to the Socratic example suggests that they are questions that each generation must answer for itself, in its own terms and in the light of its own circumstances. Though the answer that Socrates himself provided, the answer that takes the form of a calm hand reaching for a cup, has not yet been superseded or improved upon in any entirely convincing way. And so the hemlock continues to mean what it has always meant, in addition to being, as it has always been, a plant with hollow stems and small white flowers growing in the disturbed margins of a human landscape that changes in its particulars, but not in its fundamental character. A landscape in which the questions that Socrates asked are still being asked, and the answers are still proving difficult. The ecology of hemlock in the 21st century is a story of expansion and adaptation of a plant that is extending its range into new territories and establishing itself in new landscapes with an efficiency that reflects both the plant's biological adaptability and the continuing transformation of the human-modified environments in which it thrives. In North America, where hemlock has been an introduced species for several centuries, but where its populations have grown considerably in recent decades, the plant has been documented spreading into regions where it was not previously established, moving along roadsides and waterways and the edges of agricultural land with the patient persistence that characterizes successful invasive plants. The reasons for this apparent acceleration of spread are not entirely understood, but they likely include a combination of factors, including the continuing expansion of disturbed ground through road construction and agricultural modification, the movement of contaminated soil and plant material through human activities, and possibly the effects of changing climate conditions on the plant's growth and reproduction. Agricultural authorities and land managers in the United States and Canada have developed various strategies for managing hemlock populations in areas where they represent a significant hazard to livestock or a risk of human poisoning, including mechanical removal, targeted herbicide application, and public education campaigns designed to help people identify the plant reliably and avoid accidental contact or ingestion. The challenge of controlling hemlock in the modern landscape is considerable because the plant produces large quantities of seed that can remain viable in the soil for several years, and because even partial control measures tend to leave enough plants to re-establish the population within a relatively short time, if the favorable conditions that allowed the initial establishment persist. Public health advisories about hemlock have become a recurring feature of spring and early summer communications from health and agricultural authorities in many parts of North America, reflecting the recognition that the combination of the plant's widespread distribution, its resemblance to edible species, and its extreme toxicity creates a genuine and recurring public health hazard that requires active management and public education rather than simply passive awareness. The global distribution of Conium maculatum in the 21st century includes its native range across Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa, its long-established presence in South Africa and South America and Australia, where it was introduced by European settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries, and its continuing spread in North America, making it one of the most widely distributed toxic plants in the world, present on every inhabited continent and in environments ranging from sea level to considerable altitude. This global distribution is itself a kind of historical statement, a record written in the plant's geographic range of the successive waves of European expansion and settlement, and the botanical migrations that accompanied them, the carrying of familiar plants to unfamiliar places, that was such a consistent feature of the colonial period, and that has had such lasting consequences for the ecologies of every region touched by that expansion. And in the case of hemlock, this global distribution means that the plant which grew by the roadsides of Attica in the 5th century before the Common Era and which provided the means of Socrates' execution, now grows also by the roadsides of Ohio and California, and New South Wales and Patagonia, in landscapes that no ancient Greek ever imagined, carrying its ancient chemistry into the ditches and margins of a world that has changed almost beyond recognition in every other respect. The neuroscience of hemlock poisoning, as it has been understood and elaborated through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, represents the deepest level of explanation that has yet been achieved for the mechanisms behind what Plato described in the Phaedo, the ascending paralysis and the preserved consciousness, and the eventual cessation of breathing that ended the life of Socrates on a spring afternoon in ancient Athens. The neuromuscular junction, the microscopic structure at which a motor nerve fiber meets and communicates with the muscle fiber it controls, is the primary site of Conium's action. And the understanding of this structure has been one of the great achievements of 20th century neuroscience, produced through decades of elegant experimental work that revealed the molecular machinery of nerve-muscle communication in extraordinary detail. When a motor nerve fires, it releases a chemical messenger called acetylcholine into the narrow gap between the nerve terminal and the muscle membrane, and this acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle surface, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and the binding opens an ion channel in the receptor molecule, allowing electrical current to flow into the muscle cell and triggering the contraction that moves the body. Conium binds to these same nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, competing with acetylcholine for the binding site. And when conium occupies the receptor, it blocks the normal signaling process, preventing the ion channel from opening in response to the nerve signal, and leaving the muscle fiber unable to contract, a condition that produces the flaccid paralysis that characterizes hemlock poisoning. The ascending pattern of this paralysis, the way it begins in the lower extremities and moves upward through the body, reflects the differential sensitivity of different muscle groups to the paralytic effect, with the large muscles of the legs being affected first, and the smaller and more proximally located muscles of the trunk, and eventually the chest, being affected later, until the diaphragm and the accessory muscles of respiration are compromised, and the ability to breathe is lost. This mechanistic understanding of how Conium works does not, of course, change what happened in the prison cell in Athens in 399, and it does not add to or subtract from the philosophical significance of Socrates' death, or the meaning of the Hemlock cup as a symbol of conscience and authority and the costs of intellectual integrity. But it does, in a certain sense, complete a project of understanding that the ancient Greeks began when they first observed carefully and recorded accurately what hemlock did to the human body, a project that has been continued and deepened by every generation of investigators since. The molecular description of Conium's mechanism of action represents the most recent and most detailed answer to the question that any thoughtful observer of hemlock poisoning has always been implicitly asking, which is, what is actually happening at the level of the physical processes that constitute life? When this plant does what it does to a living body, and why does it happen in this particular way rather than some other? The answer that neuroscience provides is beautiful in its own way, in the way that precise mechanistic explanations of complex biological phenomena tend to be beautiful when they reveal the elegant simplicity underlying apparently complex effects, a small molecule competing with the body's own chemical messenger for a receptor site, blocking the signal that animates the muscles, leaving the mind intact while the body stills, in exactly the manner that a philosopher, preparing to argue for the immortality of the soul, might, if he were inclined toward a certain kind of grim irony, have designed. And it is worth resting with that thought for a moment, with the image of the ancient Greek philosopher in his prison cell, and the molecular machinery in his muscles gradually falling quiet as the light in Athens faded toward evening on the last day of his life. Because it is in the space between that image and that mechanism, in the gap between the human meaning and the molecular reality, that the full strangeness and the full depth of this story can be felt. It is in the nature of history, as it has always been in the nature of history, to be simultaneously complete and incomplete, to present itself as a finished story while leaving entirely visible the threads that trail off into the future, the questions that remain open, the meanings that continue to be contested and reinterpreted with each new generation that comes to the material with its own concerns and its own perspective. The history of hemlock is no different in this respect. It has a beginning in the deep evolutionary history of the plant and its alkaloids, and it has a series of momentous episodes in Athens in 399, and in the medieval monasteries, and in the Renaissance botanical gardens, and in the 19th century organic chemistry laboratories, and it has a present in the continuing spread of the plant across the global landscape, and in the continuing philosophical resonance of the Socratic death. But it does not have an ending, or rather, it has not yet arrived, at whatever ending it may eventually reach. And in that openness, in that quality of a story still in progress, it is entirely representative of the way that natural and human history always actually works. The great question that Hemlock poses, the question that every generation has answered in its own way, is not primarily a botanical question or a toxicological question or even a philosophical question, though it touches on all of these, but a question about the relationship between the individual life and the larger world in which it is embedded, about what it means to encounter a thing, whether that thing is a plant or an idea or another person or a culture, with genuine attention and genuine care, and about what accumulates in that encounter over time, the layers of meaning and knowledge and significance that make a thing more than it simply is in itself, that make a hollow-stemmed, white-flowered plant growing by the side of a road into one of the most storied objects in all of human history. The hemlock has been a medicine and a poison and a weapon of the state and a symbol of philosophical integrity and a weed in an agricultural field and a forensic specimen and a subject of chemical synthesis and an invasive species spreading through the roadsides of Ohio and California. And it has been all of these things simultaneously and in succession across the millennia of its encounter with human civilization, accumulating each meaning without losing the others. The way that genuinely significant things tend to do when they are encountered repeatedly across enough time and enough different kinds of human attention. Modern researchers continue to investigate the hemlock alkaloids for potential applications in medicine, including in the management of conditions involving abnormal neuromuscular signaling, where the precise blocking action of conium at the nicotinic receptor might, in carefully controlled and modified form, be turned to therapeutic rather than toxic purposes. Continuing the ancient tradition of attempting to leverage the plant's power toward healing rather than harm. The philosophical tradition of engaging with the Socratic death continues in the work of contemporary philosophers and political theorists and bioethicists who find in the hemlock cup a durable and inexhaustible touchstone for thinking about conscience and authority and the costs of intellectual integrity in a world that has not, in 2.5 millennia, found a fully satisfactory answer to the question of how to make those costs unnecessary. And the plant itself continues to grow in its patient and indifferent way in the ditches and roadsides and disturbed margins of 6 continents, producing its alkaloids and its small white flowers each spring with a consistency and a reliability that puts to shame most of the human projects that have attempted to engage with it. A quiet presence in the landscape that carries within its chemistry the capacity to produce, in the body of any mammal unlucky enough to consume a sufficient quantity, the same ascending paralysis that stilled the legs, and then the chest of a 70-year-old philosopher in Athens, in the spring of 399 before the Common Era, on an afternoon when the light was soft and his students wept, and the great questions remained, as they always remain, unanswered. The legacy of hemlock, considered across the full span of its human history, is ultimately a legacy of attention, of the remarkable and sustained quality of human attention that this unassuming plant has attracted across more than 2,500 years of recorded history. No other plant, perhaps, has been so continuously and so carefully observed from so many different angles and with so many different purposes by so many different kinds of people, as hemlock has been observed from the naturalists of ancient Athens to the forensic toxicologists of the 21st century, and the accumulation of that attention is itself a kind of monument, invisible but real, built from the observations and the writings, and the reflections of everyone who has ever looked carefully at a hollow stem with purple mottling and white umbel flowers and thought, here is something worth understanding. Theophrastus paid that attention in the 4th century before the Common Era, walking the hillsides and roadsides of Attica with the patient naturalist eye that his great teacher Aristotle had helped to develop, noting the habitat and the appearance and the properties of the plants he encountered, including this one, and recording his observations in the Historia Plantarum, that would become the foundation of Western botany. Dioscorides paid it in the 1st century of the Common Era, traveling with the armies of the Roman Empire and making the careful pharmacological observations that would be consulted by every subsequent generation of European physicians for 1500 years. The medieval monks paid it in their gardens, and the Renaissance botanists paid it in their botanical gardens, and the Enlightenment chemists paid it in their laboratories, and the modern toxicologists pay it in theirs, and each generation's attention has added something to the cumulative understanding, deepened some aspect of what was known, corrected some aspect of what was believed, refined the picture in ways both large and small, and alongside all of this scientific and practical attention, the philosophical and cultural attention has continued without interruption. The attention of the people who see in the Hemlock cup not a pharmacological problem, but a human one, who are drawn to the story of Socrates and the jury and the prison cell, not to understand Conium, but to understand something about conscience and community and the extraordinary courage, or perhaps the extraordinary stubbornness, or perhaps both at once, that it takes to refuse to change your answers when the questions become dangerous. This dual legacy, scientific and philosophical, botanical and symbolic, toxicological and ethical, is what makes hemlock unique among the plants of the world, what gives it a history that is genuinely unlike the history of any other living thing, a history that is at once a history of a plant and a history of a civilization's engagement with the deepest questions it has ever asked itself. And it is a history that continues as all living histories continue, not in archives or museums, but in the world itself, in the laboratory and the courtroom, and the lecture hall, and the philosophy seminar, and in the ditches and roadseeds, where the plant grows on, in quiet, patient, beautiful indifference to all of it. There is something, when you consider the whole of this long history, from the first Greek naturalist, who noted the hollow stem and the toxic properties, to the modern forensic chemist, who can detect a fraction of a milligram of Conium in a blood sample. That feels like a kind of conversation. A conversation conducted across more than 2,000 years between human beings, who were all, in their different ways, trying to understand the same thing. A plant, yes, but also the boundary between life and death that the plant embodies, the narrow and mysterious margin where a quantity too small to see can be the difference between breathing and not breathing, between thought and its absence. That margin, that boundary, is one of the oldest subjects of human inquiry, and hemlock has been its most consistent and most eloquent physical emblem. The thing you can hold in your hand that is simultaneously a botanical specimen and a philosophical proposition, a piece of the natural world and a piece of human history, a weed in the ditch and the instrument of the most famous death in Western philosophy. And perhaps that is the most restful thought of all. As the night deepens and the breath slows, and the weight of the body settles into whatever softness holds it, that the big questions, the questions about consciousness and conscience, and the value of a single human life, and the relationship between truth and power, are not new questions, and they are not questions that any single generation must answer alone. They have been asked before, in different words, and with different urgency, and they will be asked again. And in the meantime, the hemlock grows by the road, as it has always grown, small and white and patient, carrying within its chemistry the memory of an afternoon in Athens, when a man with a flat nose and direct eyes drank from a cup and lay down, and waited with perfect composure for the numbness to rise. The world he left behind was changed by his leaving, and the plant that was the instrument of that leaving became. in the centuries and millennia that followed, something that no plant has any right to be. A symbol, a touchstone, a recurring reference in the long conversation that human civilization conducts with itself about what it values and what it fears and what it is, willing to sacrifice in the name of whatever it holds most dear. And the conversation continues, as conversations about the most important things always do, without resolution, without final answer, but not without meaning, not without the quiet, accumulated wisdom of all the generations who have engaged with it before, whose thoughts and observations and reflections are present in it. The way that the chemistry of Conium is present in the hollow stem of the plant, invisible but real, active but unhurried, available to whoever comes along with the attention to find it. It is enough, on a quiet evening, to know that the story has been told many times, and will be told again, that the hemlock grows, and the questions persist, and the conversation continues, patient as the plant itself, in the soft margins of a world that is very old and very full of meaning, and very gently, in this particular moment, carrying you toward rest. And so the hemlock settles into its long history, its hollow stems quiet in the evening, its small white flowers closed against the darkening sky, its ancient chemistry patient within the tissues of the plant, waiting with the particular patience of living things that do not know they are waiting. The centuries have accumulated around it like rings in a very old tree, each one adding something, each one leaving the essential thing unchanged. And the essential thing is simply this: a plant growing by the side of the road in the marginal spaces that human life creates, and then moves on from, carrying within it the capacity for a very particular kind of ending, and carrying also, wound through every cell and every alkaloid molecule, the memory of a single afternoon in an ancient city where a man sat down and asked, one last time, what it means to know something, and what it means to live by what you know, and what it costs when the world you live in asks you not to. The question hangs in the air of that prison cell in Athens, as it has hung in the air for 2,400 years, neither answered nor abandoned. And the hemlock grows in the ditch outside, as it grew in the ditches of Attica, as it grows tonight in the ditches of every country where the plant has found its way, small and white and perfectly quiet. And here you are, safe in your bed, breathing slowly, your body heavy and warm and at rest, the long history of the world moving softly around you like water, around a stone, the centuries drifting past like clouds across a very old sky. The plant grows, the questions remain, the night is very still, and you gently are asleep.